entirely different organizations. So if you go to GitHub and you go to the Cloud Foundry organization, or you go to the Cloud Foundry Incubator organization, all of that stuff, I mean, first of all, if you can see it and you're not part of Cloud Foundry, then obviously it's open, but that's all part of the Cloud Foundry open source. We are in the process of standing up a foundation that, kind of like the Apache Foundation owns the Apache stuff, we are in the process of standing up a foundation that's going to own all of that, so there will be a clear separation between open source and commercial. We have a separate org for all of the commercial stuff, in fact, a couple of separate orgs for the commercial stuff, and for the most part, although not entirely, but for the most part, the teams are also completely separate. There are only a few teams where they're doing a mixture of commercial and open source, and the closer we get to that foundation being stood up, the more we're going to be separating that, so that we've got a very clear separation between all the things that are open and then all of the commercial interests, because we don't want to have even the perception that our commercial interests in Cloud Foundry as pivotal are polluting the open source. Does that make sense?
Okay, so and because you have like open source version, apparently like anybody can get it and install it whenever we want. But so if do you provide any kind of hosting in your environment for any free tier with hosting, like maybe some?
Yeah, so anybody who wants to get the open source code totally can, and then the question is, but do you provide any kind of free hosting? No, we really don't. So we've got run.pivotal.io is part of our commercial interests. It's a hosted environment. You can deploy your apps there. We've got a 30-day free trial, and then our prices are ridiculously cheap, and we've talked about having a free tier, but ultimately it's up to product. It's not up to me. I'm on the geek side, but the business people decided that they didn't want to support a free tier.
So I have another question.
Yes.
If you could, and I bring this up because we've had this discussion internally and we have not come to any conclusions, but if you could compare and contrast perhaps exploratory testing versus checklists. I know that there's a lot of research even in the medical field about the efficiency and effectiveness of checklists. Is there a relationship between checklists and exploratory testing, or are they valuable in different ways or in the same way?
Okay, so I love me a good checklist. Now, I do use kind of a form of checklist in exploratory testing. Usually it's the stuff that's in my head that I rattle off to myself, like, ooh, I found a text field. I know what to do with text fields. I'm going to insert really long text. I'm going to insert Unicode. I'm going to insert emojis. I'm going to, all of the evil things that you do to text fields. That's kind of like a checklist. And for that matter, I call these things heuristics, and there's a whole list of them in the book that I'm leaving behind. But what I don't do is, okay, now I'm going to explore Cloud Controller. Cloud Controller's responsibilities are to take API requests to deploy an application, and so basically Cloud Controller allows you to create, read, update, and delete applications. So it's CRUDing apps for you. So now I should have a checklist item for create an app. I should have a checklist item for read the files in an application. I should have a checklist item for updating an application. If I know what I want to do to that level of precision and repeatability, that should be an automated test. So did that? Okay, you're welcome.
I have a question. So do you recruit explorers in the community? So
I see. Sorry, keep going. I thought I knew where you were going, and then I didn't, so.
Okay.
Yes.
No, so for instance, I don't know, do you find out if there's certain people that keep reporting interesting bugs, for instance, and then you try to get them somehow involved so they understand better where you're going to, etc. So basically recruiting explorers out there in the community, get them involved in your day-to-day.
So not yet. And one of the things that's interesting about Cloud Foundry is that it's really rare for somebody to wake up one day and say, I know, I've got a spare Saturday. I feel like I want to stand up my very own Cloud Foundry. Like, the individual person typically doesn't do that. Instead, they arrive at a company that says, hey, we've made a big bet on this thing. Go for it. You're going to be working on this pull request to do whatever. So it's usually not individuals, it's companies. And as we get closer and closer to the foundation being stood up, we certainly may start to see a lot more engagement from some of the members of that foundation. What we're seeing right now is a lot of collaboration, which is super, super awesome. but I don't think we've seen specifically collaboration or contributions that are specifically about exploring yet. But I think it'll be really interesting when we do.
There's an academic paper published just 2-3 days ago, a study done from Mozilla, and they found that Agile projects have a very hard time keeping volunteers because they move so quickly. It's very difficult to parachute in and contribute to a project that's moving so quickly unless you're devoting hours every day tracking the project. This was based on Mozilla, and Kim and I know we've had the same experience here, is that I've run test events and things like this with casual contributors, even expert exploratory testers looking for hours, and the results are issues that are all either duplicate, won't fix, or else they're already in the backlog. So they don't produce very much useful information. I'll point you to this study because everybody do this study. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I would find that very interesting.
Apologies for the somewhat abstract question, but I'm hello.
Blinded.
So I'm kind of wondering, this is a problem you see in research as well. A lot of the technology that we have nowadays is possible because of research that was done like 30 years ago. But how do you actually how do you follow the trail from your exploratory testing? I imagine some of this stuff, you mentioned, for instance, the effort is like 0. But I'm wondering, how do you prevent the situation where you get like the boy who cried wolf, let's say. Someone does exploratory testing, they don't find the bug, and then eventually we become desensitized and we say, we shouldn't do this exploratory testing thing anymore. Or some bug was prevented in the future, but then you can't really account for that because the bug never happened. How do you encourage that within an organization? How do you reward it?
So far, we don't have that problem. I've actually been thrilled because you said apologies for the abstract question. I'm going to give you an abstract answer, but then I'll actually come back to your question, I swear. But I'm going to tell a story. So we set out to recruit explorers, and we managed to hire 2. And one of them was such a high caliber developer that it didn't make sense to be rotating him in and out of teams as rapidly as we had intended to rotate explorers. And so he just became a dev, and he happens to be really good at exploring. And then we've got another explorer who's a dedicated explorer. And we set out to recruit more. I mean, we've been trying really hard. I do a lot of interviews, and we're not finding more. And so, of course, I had to think, well, so how bad a problem is that? Like, do I need to start shaking the trees more to find more explorers, or what's going on? And so I started paying a lot of attention. And what I found was that wherever an explorer had touched a team, like had rotated on for any period of time, the practice stuck. It just stuck because there are always questions that we always need answers to. So without an explorer on the team, they were still writing charters, and the product manager was still prioritizing those charters, and they were still exploring. They didn't need a dedicated explorer. So the practice stuck really well, high stickiness factor. We'll still totally hire any good explorers we find, but I've totally stopped panicking about the fact that we can't find more explorers. And the high value that the organization is getting out of it still means that I'm not worried that somebody's going to say we should stop this exploring stuff. We also made it super easy. Like, exploring is just, you put a charter in the backlog as a placeholder for this thing that you're going to do. It's not a, okay, now I need a 6-month dedicated effort. It's a story, and you can prioritize the story. So it's in such small chunks. I think that the odds that somebody would say, this exploring stuff, it has no value, we shouldn't do any more of it, I think the odds are really low because the cost for each one of those is really, really low. So did I manage to answer your question? Yes, good, okay. Anything else, guys?
So related to what you just said, how long is the period that the explorer was rotated onto a team to get that stickiness?
Well, you know, the shortest rotation we had was probably a week, and it's still stuck. So I think that it just, one of the things that I love about working at Pivotal with people who are accustomed to the Pivotal Labs practices is that they're already really good explorers. They just don't know it. They don't have words to describe this thing that they do naturally. And so I think that for those developers, because that's how we built the team, is we just continued to grow those practices in a team that was very adamant about those practices. I think that when they see exploration done in a structured kind of way, like here's a charter and now we're going to investigate this charter, and oh, this is a distraction from the charter, so we're going to capture that as another charter, it feels so natural to them. They're like, oh, I finally have words to describe a thing that I just do. And so that means that we don't have to like train them in this. Although I used to get on airplanes and go help people, and one of the ways that I would help them is to train exploratory testers. And so I've run my workshops for some of the teams, and they've found that helpful because they could say, oh, I always felt like there was kind of a technique here, but I was really fuzzy on it. And so now I've got a very concrete set of ideas around what that technique was, but that's not what made it stick. All right, so it looks like there's no more questions, and it's looking to me like it's about 7:30. So how about if instead of going through all the slides, I just go to the very end and mention that you might wonder what I